My name is Alicia Aaron Boimel-Green. I'm an assistant professor at Florida International University, and I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with Dan Goldberg, the director of The Jewish Nazi, which is premiering at this year's Jewish Film Festival. Thank you all for joining us. So, Dan, I know that in your past life, you were a former editor of the Australian Jewish News. And I know this for personal reasons because actually you were my first employer. I did work experience at the Jewish News, which is an internship that all high schoolers in Australia have to do. I think you paid me $5, but I got to publish a paper. So So I know your past. Can you tell us about the transition that you made from being an editor to an investigative journalist and film director, which is what this movie seems to be about?
Yes, and thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here from Australia. Hello, Miami. Yes, I was the editor of the Australian Jewish News 20 odd years ago. I subsequently went on to work at the Sydney Morning Herald, which is probably the equivalent of what's the daily newspaper, the broadsheet in Miami, the Miami Daily News. And then I worked at a sort of news magazine called The Bulletin, which is the equivalent of Newsweek, I guess. But as you would know, print went to the wall about 20 years ago. The rivers of gold of advertising money dried up. And both of my journalism jobs ended, and I had to reinvent myself. And I've always loved long form storytelling. I love feature writing more than news reporting and investigations. So I somehow reinvented myself as a documentary maker, because in the end, storytelling, it's the same idea. It's just a different medium. Just so happens that filmmaking is 100 times more complicated than journalism, because in journalism, you start with a blank piece of paper, you do all your research, you write, it's kind of binary or mono, whereas film is multi-layered. You've got dialogue, you've got effects, you've got film, you've got sound, you've got music, you've got graphics, and they all have to come together in a narrative arc that ends with the viewer walking away feeling something. So that's how I made the transition, and I've been doing that for the last 17 years. And this film, I've been a journalist for 35 odd years, and this story, more probably than any other story, sucked me in a way that I didn't expect. And also from a Jewish journalist point of view, sucked me in a very personal way.
That's really interesting about how you're transitioned to many more layers once you move from print to media and directing the media in that way. I hadn't thought about that. So actually, my next question was, when did you first encounter this story? Because the movie seems to track a long arc, right, that you take us through.
Yes,
So can you tell us what it was like in real time?
yes, and as you mentioned, the Australian Jewish News, where we both crossed paths 25 years ago, it started there because film, the first film, which you see a little snippet of it in my film, the first documentary was in 2003, and I was editor of the Jewish News, and we published a review of it, and it won an award at an Australian Film Festival. But I remember thinking back then, it's such a bizarre story. A Jewish boy gets taken by a Latvian battalion who get absorbed by the SS, and why is it not talked about more in our community, and why don't we know this guy more? And then we published another article when the book came out, which we talk about in the film. The book came out in 2007, but it wasn't really until 2000, and I think it was 11, 12, when Keith Moore, who's in the film, the investigative journalist from the Herald Sun, when he broke the story about the alleged hoax then I really sat up and I was like, whoa, okay, let me look into this because I know my editors in Tel Aviv and London and New York and so on would be interested. And that's really when I first got sucked into the mystery of the mascot. And it's now 2024, 25 almost. So it's been a long time.
Well, well. And
Mm.
if we are we're assuming everyone's watched the film so we can do a spoiler alert, but
Yeah.
what's your feeling at the end of the journey, or at this point in the journey, after the film and he does DNA testing, it's verified that he's Jewish, but there's still this open question of the Panok family.
Yeah.
Yeah, where do
Right.
you stand? Or how do you feel
Look,
about it at this point?
it's a good question. I have a few thoughts. Number one, I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist. So I'm assuming that the DNA is correct, and I can only take the advice of experts. So, assuming that the DNA is correct, he is Jewish, he is from Koidanov. Nobody disputes that he was the boy in the battalion. We have the prima facie records from the battalion that are held at the Hoover Institute in Stanford University. So, that is watertight, I believe. The piece in the puzzle that is not verifiable are the period of time from when the massacre happened in October 41
Mhm.
to the taking into the battalion, which was July 12, 1942. What happened in those months is unclear. And in actual fact, and I don't think we included it in the film, or maybe we did, but the historian, venerated, respected Conrad Quake, does suggest that there was a second massacre in Koidanov, in a smaller massacre in March of 1942, and it does potentially make more sense that he survived from March to July because the winter of 41-42 was brutal. I believe
Right.
the Baltic Sea froze. So that's one still outstanding question. The second outstanding question is, was he, or could he still have been a Panok? The answer is yes. We all come from two lines, your mother's and your father's line. So we know the DNA tells us he is a part of the Sulsky Edelman family, beautiful
Mhm.
family who are now based in Canada, and you've met them. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't still be a Panok on the other side. So that is the open question, number two. And obviously, my third thought is just this is such a WTF story, excuse the language, that it would not surprise me, put it like this, it would not surprise me if there's still one more twist in this tale. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Um, so how did it feel to appear in your first movie? In this movie? And is it your first time?
Yes, it is. It's awful. It's absolutely excruciating. I have spent 35 years of my life being a journalist where you, the reader or the viewer, are not supposed to see or hear me and just to feel that it's an impartial piece of journalism. Sadly, I gave in after 35 years, mainly because, look, it is a complicated story. And I realized quite early on in the piece that I could help you, the viewer, understand it a bit easier, distill and compress complex points, hopefully. You guys be the judge. But also, it did become a bit of an investigation for me. Like I had on my wall the classic whiteboard with
Oh, that's great.
arrows and
That should be in the
cards, and
movie.
yeah, and
Do you have a
I felt
picture of
like I
that?
was tracking down the truth. And so we know from, this is the golden age of documentary, in part thanks to Netflix and co. And so we know that the audiences love an investigation in real time that they can see and feel. And so I became that guy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's a documentary device, actually, that we parachute me or a protagonist, and I happen to be the protagonist, into the film, it adds another layer. Otherwise, you would be watching talking heads and a bit of archive, and that's kind of old-fashioned filmmaking.
And that, I guess, brings me actually to my next question is how did you choose what to act out, what to pull from the archives, what to take from recordings? I mean, presumably there's infinite amounts of materials. How did you choose those?
Well, that's a good question, and it is enormous amount of work. I mean, the sea of archival material in itself was vast, and so just mining, going on a deep dive and mining the best bits of the archive was a mammoth task, which members of my team undertook with me. The editing process was months and months and months. In the end, our job is to piece together a whole string of sequences that we filmed to make them make sense to the viewer, and more than that, make them feel like there's revelations and that there's a propulsive nature to the documentary when you're directing or building an investigative documentary. It needs the element of surprises, revelations, and the propulsion that you feel this narrative arc unfolding before your eyes. And so if you look at Act One in our language, we call them Act One, Act Two, Act Three. Act One, emotionally, what I was trying to do in Act One was get the viewer to feel empathy. Oh my God, this child experienced what no other child should experience. In Act Two, which is the middle of the film, I wanted people to feel, oh my God, is this a hoax? And if it is, that's outrageous because the Holocaust is way too sacred to be tampered with. And then Act Three, I wanted the idea of resolution, that we have actually gone through this whole roller coaster journey and come to a resolution that he was Jewish, he was the kid in the photo, and he was from Koidanov. So the other answer to your question is the challenge for us is what to leave out as much as what to leave in. And we have left out so much material on the cutting room floor. But in breaking news, I can share with you, and you're in America, it'll be global, but I've just finished a 5-part podcast on the story. And a lot of the material that we left out will be in the podcast, because in a podcast, and this is fascinating to me because I'm a virgin, I've never made a podcast before, but I'm making it with CBC Canada, and they are experts. And what's fascinating in terms of the difference between a documentary and a podcast is, in a podcast, in each episode, I will take you down the rabbit hole with 1 or 2 characters for half an hour, and then we'll come back up, and the next episode I'll go down another part of the story with another 1 or 2 characters. But you only, because it's through your ears, you're only going to hear a couple of characters per episode. So that's been a fascinating revelation. And if you do want more of the story, you'll be able to hear it in early 2025 on the podcast.
Well, so you're really covering all the types of media.
Well, they commissioned it because they thought it was such an epic story, and they are in the podcast world, and podcasts, as you know, have become very, very popular.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I told the mascot that I would tell his story, and now I'm kind of doing that on a bunch of platforms.
That's amazing. So, you mentioned that in Act One, your intention was, to show the audience the trauma and what this child went through. And you have a child actor acting as the mascot. What was it like to work with a child actor in a Holocaust themed movie with such like adult, I guess, content or themes at least?
Yeah, another good question. I will take that in 2 parts. The first thing to say is, how did we get to that idea? And very early on in the filmmaking process, we realized that in order for the viewer to empathize, and that was the idea for Act One, empathy. They had to feel the child soldier. They had to feel the mascot. How were we going to do that? We only had very small amounts of videotape from the Nazi Rio in 1943, where you see him marching around as an Aryan poster boy. And we had a couple of black and white photographs. So it wasn't my idea. My editor, Mark Midas, he came up with the idea of what if we cast a child and actually get a costume designer to match the costume, and we shoot it in a way that makes it feel real. And then the idea was that we could mix between the recreation and the archive in a more seamless way, so as the viewer would sort of be able to put their feet in his boots, in his footsteps, as it were. So I think it was a brilliant device for us to just give the viewer more ability to walk in the shoes of the child, because that is actually the most galling thing of all. Imagine,
Yeah.
you imagine what it must have been like. A choiceless choice is what Leon, the Canadian cousin, said. It was a choiceless choice. So to your question, sorry, that was a detour. What was it
It was great.
like? It was challenging. It was wonderful. He was amazing. He, of course, is only 8 years old, so we didn't burden him with the graphic detail of the murders and the Holocaust and the gassing, and he's too young for that. We explained the top line idea of the story, that he was a toy soldier, a mascot, a child soldier, and he just had such a wonderful face. That's what I wanted. The
Yes. Yes,
innocence.
he
The
did.
innocence. He just smiled, and he just looked so perfect, and we were just we also shot it, unless some members of your audience work in the film world, you may not notice, but we shot it on a camera called Super 8. That was the camera used in the 50s and 60s post-war. And
Oh,
it gives
wow.
that grainy texture, because we didn't want it to look all high-end and fancy. We wanted
Right.
to shoot it in a way that made it feel of its era, so as it could blend in seamlessly with the archive. So that was another behind-the-scenes technique that we used. And a funny story, we had to, because it's so rare, we had to send these tapes, they're on old-fashioned Super 8 tapes, to Melbourne to get digitized so as we could edit them. The tapes got lost in the post, and we were freaking out, thinking, oh my God, we've lost this epic material. We're going to have to reshoot it. It's going to cost us a fortune. Anyway, thank God we found them. So yeah, it all
The
worked.
Dead Letter Office, which
Yeah.
is another movie I studied. Yes.
You studied the Dead Letter Office?
Yeah, in high school.
I love that story. There's a Dead Letter Office in Australia Post, and I think that's so fascinating, the stuff that goes in there. You've given me my next movie. Thank you. Thank you. I'm writing it down.
Great.
It's a
Great.
great title. It's a great
I'll
title, the Dead
interview you
Letter
for
Office.
that one too.
Okay.
So, on another motive, I guess still related to the child, is the seesaw and the clock.
Yes.
Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yes, and I'm very impressed, because they are visual devices. So one day my editor walked into the edit room and he said, Dan, we are struggling for visual material to cover. What we didn't want was, as I mentioned before, the tradition in documentary talking heads, and it's all a bit flat and stale
Right.
and very dynamic. So we would meet every morning for coffee, and we would always have these wild, wacky ideas. And one day he came, he said he rewatched the 1943 Nazi propaganda reel, and he saw two things. He saw a seesaw and a blindfold.
Oh,
And
wow.
we just had this epiphany moment where we were like, holy shit, what if we can use those ideas as metaphors? So the blindfold is this idea about the scales of justice. So the seesaw was like the scales of justice, truth. What is true and what is not true? Is it a hoax? Is it not a hoax? The blindfold. The kid has been blinded by the truth. He's been brainwashed. He's got a masked. His identity's been stolen, and we just thought it's going to be such a powerful visual technique that we don't need to explain it to the viewer. They can interpret it. There's all ways to interpret it, and that's the beauty of a metaphor in visual filmmaking. So, and then when we started really squeezing the end of the film, how are we going to end the film? How are we going to end the film? And then we just thought, I really want to swear, but I know it's appropriate, so inappropriate, so I won't. Scottish swearing is not really swearing, but we just
Like
thought
Australian.
F-bomb. Yeah, like Australia. F-bomb, the seesaw, but you don't need to see him, we need to hear him. And what is the most powerful line that we could find just to roll under an empty seesaw? And that's how the film ended. And full credit to my lead editor. He was a creative genius and largely responsible for a lot of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned the seesaw and truth, and to me that was one of the big themes of the movie was, the story and the truth of the story and belief of the story, and I guess the truth of his memories because he was a child. Um, do you think that some of the questions of truth also came because of the nature of his unique circumstance where he was adopted? I mean, he was taken on by Nazis, and then it seems even afterwards he was adopted and brought to Australia by Nazis, and doesn't seem to have been part of the Jewish community. Do you think that played a role in people finding it difficult to believe him?
Yeah, totally. In hindsight, even Philip Meisel, Zichrono Livracha, he didn't believe him from day one at the Holocaust Center in Melbourne. I think the Jewish community in general didn't want a bar of it. It was too confronting for them. A Jew, a survivor, good, but wait, he slept with the enemy, but wait, it's all complicated. Is it a hoax? Is it not a hoax? So he was shunned, he was ostracized. And then there's the element of money. He wanted money to give his testimony. That's a massive flag. He wanted money to become a Jew again. This is weird. Like, who does that? But in the constellation of the entirety of the story, you can forgive this man, I think, because he got dealt, a shocking card. He got dealt the worst. And again, what would you have done? And how would you have behaved?
Yeah.
And, he was a child and therefore he was brainwashed. So all of his childhood father figures, the lessons he was taught were heinous. So can you blame the man? People think, wow, he was an adult when he asked for money and da. Yeah, but all of his guiding principles in life were from Nazis. So I think, look, it's such a minefield, and I do understand those people in the Jewish community who didn't want anything to do with them. I respect them, but I also kind of feel like, who are we to judge? What would we have done?
100%. 100%. Were you trying to portray that idea? I noticed that he went from being a mascot to working in a circus, and it seemed like this type of and also his relatives describe him as being very playful and acting out and always putting on a show. So was that maybe a way of showing the audience that his childhood, impacted him throughout his life in that manner, in the way that he presented himself to the world? Even through adulthood.
Yeah, I think the circus is, I think, an escape. into a
Okay.
fantasy land. If you had survived the trauma of what he had survived, where would you want to go? Would you want to be
Right.
reminded of it every day, or would you want to enter into a fantasy world, a circus, a traveling circus with an elephant? And of course, if you ask me, I would join the circus,
Right.
and also just compartmentalize um, that nightmare in my brain and try and I think he did that, but of course we know today it's called PTSD. Back in those days, it didn't exist as an idea. Of course, he was traumatized, and he spent the rest of his life, finally, the last 25 years, trying to look for his identity and going through that whole nightmare. And look, I just need to say, I visited him. I saw the squalor that he lived in, and that was not a good vision, and not it just was an awful sight. So there's no doubt that he lived in poverty. Did he gamble? Sure. Would I have gambled if I was surviving the story he survived? Probably. So I just don't think it's for us to judge. I think you watch the film, make up your own mind about where you sit with it. But I just wanted to lay, and that point in being on the film, because my job was to lay out all the pieces of this puzzle and then let you, the audience, take away the truth that you want to believe.
Okay. Um, yeah, you mentioned the Melbourne Jewish community, and I think it might be interesting for the audience to know this, that the Melbourne Jewish community is one of the biggest communities of Holocaust survivors. I mean, when I was a kid, I thought that when you get old, you talk in a European accent. It never occurred to me that uh, old people can speak with an Australian accent, because I never met them. Can you talk about that a little bit? I think the audience might be interested.
Look, it's on record. I'm not a historian, but it's on record that Melbourne has the largest pro rata Holocaust survivor community outside of Israel. Um, there is there was a massive survivor community in the tens of thousands. Obviously, today they are few and far between, but there are still, I know because I talked to somebody at the Holocaust Museum yesterday, there are still about a dozen survivors, many child survivors, who are giving testimony still to children. I don't know what it is. And Americans have to visit in year 10 or year 11 high school. They have to visit the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne and Sydney, depending on where you live. I will also say this is a curious fact. I'm working on another film about the last Nazis in Australia. And this is interesting to me, that on the boats that left Europe after the war, hundreds and hundreds of Holocaust survivors wanted to the farthest corner of the earth for obvious reasons, and that was Australia. What they didn't know, and what we now do know, is that there were hundreds of Nazi war criminals who were also trying to flee Europe because they didn't want to be prosecuted and executed. And they were trying to escape to the farthest reaches of the earth. And some of them were in those boats in the same steerage as the Holocaust survivors. So the awful irony of the idea that one boat had Holocaust survivors and their perpetrators in the same boat is staggering. And the last thing I'll say on that is we do believe that the last alleged Nazi, died here in Australia as a free man. And Australia is the only Western country in the world that failed to prosecute a single Nazi war criminal. That is a story for another, and that you'll see hopefully in my next film. But we can talk about that next time.
Okay. I think I have time for just one more question. Sure. So I noticed that he talks, about finding his name, and that's part of his identity. But there isn't much discussion about his Jewishness or culture or religion. Can you comment on that? Did it come up, or was it
Sure.
just not on the table?
No, no. I mean, this was a man, let's not forget, who was adopted by a battalion at a very young age. He may have been 5, 6, 7, 8. Then he survives the war, gets adopted by a Latvian family, gets brought to Melbourne, spends the next 40 years as a Latvian, and only in the last 25 years goes on a search. He thinks he's Jewish, but he marries a Christian woman. He has 3 sons. He lives far, far away from the bagel belt, so the Borscht Belt of Melbourne. He has no connection with the Jews. And
Right.
Philip Meisel accurately, I think, summed it up when he said, I can't remember if it's in the film or not, he didn't have a Jewish neshama. He didn't have a Jewish bone in his body. Really, he was born Jewish, but it was taken away from him. So, you know, he had no cultural or religious connection to Yiddishkeit. And so, again, who are we to judge? That is how his story played out. So, you know, the fact that in the twilight of his life, he confirmed he was Jewish and his Jewish family embraced him as Jewish is wonderful. But you know, he got cremated, which we Jews don't do. So there's
Right.
all these questions and challenging. It's a really challenging story for Jews. I think, you know,
Yeah.
let me speak for myself. It was really challenging for me. You guys decide how it was for you.
Yes, I perceived it that way as well. I mean, it's a very unique story and different to the ones we're used to, and it
Yeah,
raises up all these moral conflicts and
that's right.
identity conflicts and with the hoax and all of these things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think I could talk about it for a lot longer, but we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you for joining me here today. And I'd also like to, once again, um, thank you to our members and sponsors and community partners, the volunteers and all the film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, CASE, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their support. And thank you to our audience for participating in the 28th Miami Jewish Film Festival.